Many of us think that trout primarily spend most of their time close to the bottom of the river because the current is slower at the bottom of the river, so they expend less energy. That is one reason they hang out close to the bottom, but not the only reason. There are other reasons, and a lot of them have to do with the trout's vision. We need to realize that a trout's eyesight affects its behavior, both as predator and prey. The trout's eye doesn't have the same capabilities as our eyes. We are frequently told that trout are located at certain places in the river due to slower current, water temperature, and protection from predators. While all of this may be true, the trout's vision plays an important role in their behavior and where they choose to locate as well. And that means it will have an effect on our tactics as a fly angler. While we think in terms of day and night, the trout live in a world that is dark and darker. In episodes 2 and 3 of the How Trout See installment of videos, we learned about attenuation. Because of attenuation, there is always a limited amount of light in the water. In the rivers we fish, it is likely that at a depth of 1 meter, more than half of the light has already been lost. Even just a few feet under the surface, the trout's world is much darker than ours. So the trout's world is a pretty dark place, even during the day. A trout's eye is designed to make the most of this situation by letting in as much light as possible. Trout can't regulate the amount of light entering their eye the way that we do, and changes in light levels will alter the trout's vision. We can dilate our pupils, and we have eyelids that can further limit the amount of light, like when we squint. Trout don't have eyelids, and they cannot dilate their pupils. Trout do have a pigment in their eye that changes based on things like light levels and water temperatures at different times of the year, but it's not something that reacts quickly like our pupils or our eyelids. For trout, it's not a matter of seconds to adjust, it's more a matter of minutes or hours. Sudden changes in light, like the sun breaking through the clouds on an overcast day, are a problem for the trout. If you've ever had an eye exam where they dilated your pupils, you have some idea of what it's like to be a trout. For a few hours after the exam, your pupil remains fully dilated and cannot react to different levels of light, resulting in blurred vision and sensitivity to light. It's the same for trout. Because a trout's eye is set up for dark conditions and letting in the maximum amount of light, any changes in the amount of light can have a dramatic effect on the trout's vision. The trout only has one mechanism for quickly controlling the amount of light that enters the eye: finding darker water. This can be an area of the river that is shaded, but most often it's deeper water. Trout will head to the bottom of the river and use attenuation to their advantage to limit the amount of light entering their eyes and improve their vision. How many times have all of us been on the water on a nice sunny day with clear water and a nice hatch going on, and then watched as a trout came up to the surface and completely missed either a real bug or a dry fly floating on the surface? As the trout gets closer to the surface, more light is entering the trout's eye. The trout has no way to quickly adapt to the changing light conditions, so there is more light than the trout wants, and the trout's vision blurs. It's just like this video clip. When the camera is properly adjusted for the amount of light, you can see the fly just fine. But when I add more light, the video gets blown out. Colors are much less visible, contrast disappears along with depth perception, and edges become much less obvious. The trout that we spend so much time trying to catch are predators that feed on a variety of prey. But the trout themselves are prey for bears, raccoons, birds, larger fish, and otters. As both predator and prey, trout are heavily dependent on their eyesight to find food as well as avoid becoming food. One of the most impressive things about a trout's vision is the trout's field of view. Unlike the flat lens of our eyes, the trout have a spherical lens that is able to focus light entering the eye from any angle. The trout can see almost all the way around its entire body, 330 degrees in both the horizontal and vertical planes. This is incredibly useful for the trout from a prey standpoint. It's hard to sneak up on something with a 330-degree field of view. But this massive field of view does come with some limitations. The trout has its eyes located laterally, one on each side of its head. Each eye has a field of view of about 165 degrees, but most of the 165 degrees is seen by only one eye, or what is called monocular vision. The main drawback to monocular vision is that it affects depth perception. Trout primarily rely on their monocular vision to avoid other underwater predators, detecting movement and contrast. A trout's eyes are not parallel to each other. They angle in a bit towards the trout's nose. There are two significant results to this. First is that the 165-degree arcs overlap each other. In this overlap, the trout can see the area with both eyes at the same time. Second is that there is a blind spot that is created behind the fish where the arcs do not overlap. Where the arcs overlap, the trout enjoys binocular vision with increased detail, depth perception, and a better ability to focus. This area of binocular vision primarily covers the area in front of the trout as well as an area above the trout. Trout can use their monocular peripheral vision to detect items that might be food, but the binocular vision is what the trout relies on as a predator. Even if a trout detects an item that might be food in its monocular vision, it will reposition itself to focus on the item with its binocular vision to determine if it's food or not. When comparing the trout's monocular versus binocular vision, we can think of the trout as being both near and farsighted. In the monocular field, the trout is mostly farsighted, keeping an eye on things in the distance. In the binocular field, the trout is more nearsighted, with things being in better focus the closer they are to the trout. What's amazing about this is that the trout can observe both fields simultaneously, observing its surroundings in the distance with the monocular vision and focusing on items that might be food with the binocular vision. Many articles over the last few decades have suggested that fly anglers take advantage of the trout's rear blind spot to sneak up on the trout. This would seem to make sense, and in practice, it probably gives you your best chance to sneak up on a trout. The further you are behind the trout, the wider the blind spot gets. The further you are behind the trout, the less the trout is able to detect you. In reality, the only way this blind spot hides the angler is if the trout is completely stationary. With its massive field of vision, if the trout drifts a few inches to one side or moves its head in either direction, the angler will very quickly enter the trout's field of view and the trout will become aware of the angler. The blind spot also only hides the portion of the angler that is under the water. What the trout see above the water has little to do with the trout's vision and more to do with how light and water interact. And we'll talk about this in a subsequent video. It's still a good practice, but don't expect miracles. Trout have other blind spots as well. Because of the location of the trout's eyes and the shape of the trout's body, trout cannot see directly below themselves. And here is another reason that trout might spend more of their time along the bottom of the river. When trout are right along the bottom of the river, they can use their pectoral fins to feel the bottom of the river. When trout are resting or being very lazy, they can hover just above the bottom, feeling the bottom with their pectoral fins and know that nothing can sneak up on them from below. Trout also have a blind spot right in front of their nose, But this blind spot is much smaller than it might appear for 3 reasons. First, the trout's eyes actually bulge out from their body. This makes them more susceptible to injury, but affords them their much wider field of view. Second, the trout's pupil is not a circle like our eye, more of a teardrop shape, with the tapered end extending towards the nose. This extended side of the pupil is often referred to as a notch and allows more light to enter the lens of the eye from the frontal direction. It's very easy to see the shape of the pupil in this photo because the trout has a cataract. Yes, trout get cataracts. But you can clearly see the teardrop shape of the pupil versus the round white lens of the trout's eye. With its oddly shaped pupil, the trout can see right along its nose using both eyes and still maintain its peripheral vision without going cross-eyed. This doesn't entirely reduce the blind spot, but it reduces it to a very small area in front of their nose. Anything that close is probably already destined to be a snack for the trout. The third factor is that they also have a groove between the bottom of their eye and their maxillary that gives them the ability to rotate the pupil very far to the front as well as very far down and see in a downward direction. We frequently see trout using this as they approach dry flies, with their body tilted at an angle, looking across their nose as the dry fly approaches. In this picture, you can see the trout checking out the camera, even though the camera is in front of and below the trout. With the bulging eyes, the teardrop pupil, and the groove, all the trout has to do is rotate its eyes a bit to check out the camera without ever moving its position. Now for the important question. What does all this mean for my fishing? Consider what you're asking of the trout. We know that there are factors that can have a negative impact on the trout's vision, like too much light. Frequently, we wind up fishing either a nymph at a certain depth or a dry fly on the surface that asks the trout to come further up in the water column, negatively impacting their vision. And then we have the audacity to blame the trout for either refusing or missing our fly. The truth is that the trout may not be able to see the fly very well, or the trout's vision blurs as it approaches the fly, or the trout loses track of the fly because of too much light. At this point, the trout may decide to take the safer route and just return to where it was holding. We have to recognize the limitations of the trout's vision and meet the trout on their terms. The less you ask of the trout, the better your chances of success. You need to pay attention to your surroundings. But when you look around, look at it from the trout's point of view and make sure and take your sunglasses off. Otherwise, you're likely to misjudge how bright it is and how much light there is. We first need to consider exactly how much light there is. Trout will likely be holding in deeper, darker water on bright sunny days. On a very overcast day with no break in the clouds to allow the sunlight through, there can be as much as a 70% reduction in solar radiation. With the reduced amount of sunlight, trout will probably feel more comfortable roaming through the water column or even approaching the surface. We also need to consider what we learned in episodes 2 and 3 about attenuation. We're often told to look for areas where the color of the water changes because the darker water will indicate a change in depth. But why are trout likely to be holding there? From a vision standpoint, that change in depth means more attenuation, a reduction in the intensity of light, and potentially better vision for the trout. We also need to be cognizant of the fact that if a trout is holding in very clear, shallow water on a sunny day, the trout's vision is probably being impacted by the excess amounts of light. How many times have you seen a nice trout holding in conditions like this, only to have the trout ignore your fly on every drift? It's possible that the trout isn't ignoring your fly. Maybe the trout can't see well enough to even consider your fly. Now that we understand the trout's field of view and its monocular and binocular vision, it becomes abundantly clear why we are told we need to make accurate casts and why getting the proper drift is so important. In episode 3, we learned that the best visibility we can expect in a river is about 10 feet, and that in most rivers we fish, visibility will be much less than that, often 3 feet or less. Trout primarily rely on their binocular vision while searching for food, and that binocular vision mostly exists in a small area in front of and above the trout. If we look at that cone of binocular vision over a distance of 10 feet, the width and height is only about 5 feet. At 3 feet, that reduces to about 1 meter. The fact that we're fishing in moving water further complicates this. Trout prefer to hold in water that is moving about walking speed, or about 3 miles per hour. This means that it takes 2.25 seconds for our fly to travel 10 feet. So at 10 feet, we have a window that is 5 feet wide. In 1 more second, the fly will be 5.5 feet from the trout, and the window will only be about 3 feet wide. In 1 more second, the fly will be 14 inches from the trout, and the window will only be about 7 to 8 inches wide. And in 1 more second, the nymph will be 3 feet behind the trout. That cone of binocular vision narrows very fast at 3 miles per hour. If we are getting a good drift and the fly is traveling down a single seam and not crossing the river, you can see that a fly enters the edge of the binocular cone and then will exit the binocular cone of vision very quickly and is then in the monocular cone of vision. If the fly is in the monocular cone of vision, the trout will have to reposition itself to even get a good look at the fly, and then decide whether or not to take the fly, all in about 2 seconds. Again, we are always going to be most successful when we meet the trout on their terms and ask as little as possible from them. If we can get the fly closer to the center of the binocular cone of vision, this will increase the amount of time that the trout can see it and requires the least amount of effort on the trout's part, increasing the odds that the trout might take our fly. This is hard enough to do when you can see the trout, much less when the visibility is reduced and you can't see the trout. This is why you hear anglers talking about dissecting the river or painting the river with their casts and drifts. If the visibility is, say, 3 feet, for example, then our fly needs to be within 10 inches to either side of the trout and within 10 inches above and below the trout to be in the binocular vision. That's a pretty tight window. If you're just randomly casting and then drifting your fly through a run, what are the odds that you're going to hit that window? Well, they're pretty low. If you don't hit that window, you're hoping that the trout will notice the fly in its monocular vision and reposition itself. The trout might do that, but it probably won't move very far. You're asking more of the trout, decreasing your odds. This is one of the reasons that tightline nymphing or Euro nymphing is so effective. You have a lot more control over the drift of your fly, and you can get very precise drifts with precise control over the depth of the fly, and then you can dissect the river. You may have seen this clip in one of our previous videos. On the day I was fishing this particular pool, visibility was about 3 feet and I couldn't see any trout in the pool. The wind was making it hard to get a good drift, but I managed to catch a few fish from the pool. It wasn't until later when I viewed the underwater footage that I realized just how loaded with trout it really was. Had I been more deliberate with my drifts, I likely would have caught a lot more fish. Notice how the trout are mostly holding in one spot, maintaining their position at a certain depth. If you keep your drifts parallel, gradually extending the drifts further out, you are much more likely to eventually get your fly into that binocular cone of one of the trout, taking your fly to the trout instead of asking the trout to come to the fly. Vision is incredibly important to trout and can influence the trout's behavior. Understanding this can help you better understand where the trout are, why they're there, and what you need to do to get your fly in front of the trout. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.